The day started like any other, quiet and calm, the gentle lapping of water against my dock the only sound that filled the air. I had just finished my morning coffee when a white SUV rolled up the gravel path leading to my property. Out stepped three people wearing matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. I knew immediately what was coming. For months, the Homeowners Association had been sending me letters about my dock, claiming it violated some rule about unapproved extensions into shared waterways. I had ignored their letters, not out of defiance but because I knew something they didn't. The water wasn't under their jurisdiction. Still, seeing them approach with clipboards and smug expressions was enough to sour my morning. The man in front, clearly the spokesperson, strutted up to me with the authority of someone who believed he owned the place. "Good morning," he said, not bothering to smile. "We're here regarding your unauthorized dock." He gestured toward the water as if I might have forgotten what a dock looked like. I set down my mug, leaned against the railing, and asked, "Unauthorized by who?" The woman beside him, who had the sharp, pinched look of someone who enjoyed telling others what to do, chimed in, "By the HOA, of course. This structure violates Section 14, Article 3 of the Community Guidelines. You'll need to have it removed immediately." I could have laughed right then, but I didn't. Instead, I asked them to explain exactly what they thought I'd done wrong. They rattled off some nonsense about encroachment and community standards, waving their clipboards around like court orders. It was clear they thought they were untouchable, backed by the full weight of the HOA. I listened patiently, nodding as they spoke, all the while thinking how satisfying it would be to watch their expressions change once they realized how wrong they were. When they finally stopped talking, I asked a single question. "Do you have jurisdiction over the lake?" The man blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Of course," he said, regaining his composure. "This entire area falls under our association's management." I smiled then, slow and deliberate. "You might want to double-check that," I said. They looked at each other, confused. I went inside, grabbed a folder from my desk, and came back out. Inside were the original deeds, surveys, and water rights documents that had come with the property when I inherited it from my grandfather. He had purchased not just the land, but the entire network of waterways that ran through this county, an old legal quirk that most people didn't even realize still existed. I handed them the folder and watched as they flipped through it. Their faces shifted from superiority to disbelief to something close to panic. The woman muttered, "This can't be right." The man frowned, scanning the papers. "You're saying you own the water, every stream, pond, and canal within the county limits," I said, keeping my tone even. "Including the one your HOA thinks it manages." There was a long silence. I could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they realized what that meant. If I owned the waterways, then their rules about docks, boats, and shoreline maintenance meant nothing here. In fact, technically, every member of their HOA with a property that bordered the water was leasing access from me, though most of them had no idea. The woman finally found her voice. "We'll have to verify this," she said tightly. "You do that," I replied. "In the meantime, I'll expect your organization to stop trespassing on my property." They left soon after, their confidence gone. I stood by the dock watching their SUV disappear down the road, feeling a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. I had always kept my grandfather's records safe, but I never imagined they'd come in handy like this. Over the next few days, I heard whispers around town. Apparently, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting to discuss property line discrepancies. Word traveled fast in a small community, and soon enough, neighbors were stopping by to ask if it was true that I owned the waterways. I showed a few of them the paperwork, and their reactions ranged from shock to delight. Many of them had been battling the HOA for years over trivial things: paint colors, fence heights, even what kind of flowers they could plant near the shore. The idea that the HOA's authority didn't actually extend to the water had everyone buzzing. A week later, the same SUV returned, but this time only the man came. His posture was different, less confident, more cautious. He apologized for the misunderstanding and said they had reviewed the legal documents. It turned out I was right. The waterways were indeed privately owned, and the association had no jurisdiction over them. He even tried to smooth things over, suggesting we could collaborate to ensure mutual benefit. I declined politely. "I think it's best if you and your board stay on your side of the road," I said. "From the water line out, it's mine." He nodded stiffly and left without another word. After that, things changed around here. The HOA stopped sending out those aggressive letters. The patrols that used to drive by to inspect docks and shorelines suddenly stopped. Neighbors began to relax, enjoying their waterfronts without fear of being fined for something ridiculous. And me, I added a new sign near the dock, just for good measure. It read, "Private Waterway. Access by permission only." Every time I saw it, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes I still think about how close I came to tearing down the dock just to avoid the hassle. If I hadn't remembered those old documents, the HOA might have gotten away with bullying yet another homeowner. But instead, they learned a hard lesson about assuming authority where none exists. It wasn't just about the dock, it was about standing your ground and knowing your rights. My grandfather used to say, "The man who owns the water controls the land." I never understood that as a kid, but now I see exactly what he meant. That dock isn't just a place to fish or watch the sunset anymore. It's a reminder that sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds all the power and the loudest ones are just making noise. When the HOA left my property that day, I knew the story wasn't over. They were the kind of people who couldn't accept being wrong, especially when their authority was challenged. Sure enough, a few days later, I got an envelope in the mail with the HOA seal on it. Inside was a carefully worded letter stating that they were reviewing ownership claims regarding the local waterways and would temporarily suspend enforcement actions pending verification. I had to laugh at that. They were trying to make it sound like they were still in control, when in reality, they had already been knocked off their pedestal. But their letter reminded me that it was time to dig deeper into what I actually owned. I knew I had inherited the property from my grandfather, but I had never really explored the full extent of what that meant. I decided to drive into town and visit the county records office to see what else I could find. The records clerk was an older man named Hank who had worked there for decades. When I told him my grandfather's name, he raised an eyebrow. "You're Robert Ellison's grandson?" he asked. I nodded, and he chuckled. "Your grandfather was a legend around here. Smart man. Most folks don't realize how much land and water he bought up back in the day." He led me into the archives room, where the air smelled faintly of old paper and dust. He pulled a few large folders from a shelf and laid them out on a table. "These are the original deeds and water rights. Your grandfather was meticulous about keeping things official." As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I began to realize just how much control I had inherited. The documents weren't just about the lake behind my property. They referenced a whole system of interconnected waterways, streams, creeks, ponds, and irrigation channels that spread across the entire county. Apparently, decades ago, the land was divided up among private owners, but my grandfather had bought the water rights piece by piece, taking advantage of a loophole that allowed him to claim ownership of the waterways without buying all the surrounding land. Over time, those rights became something of a forgotten relic. People stopped paying attention, and when new developments were built including the HOA's neighborhood, no one bothered to check who owned the water itself. The further I read, the clearer it became, I wasn't just a homeowner with a dock. I was the legal owner of nearly every navigable waterway in the county, every lake, every stream that connected to the main channel, every pond fed by that water. It all fell under my name. My grandfather had left it to me because, in his words, someone in the family should remember who really holds the flow. I sat there in silence, running my fingers over his old signature on the documents, feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief. This wasn't just about land or money, it was about legacy. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing, and now it was my turn to protect it. After making certified copies of the documents, I stopped by the county surveyor's office to confirm the boundaries. The surveyor, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, mapped everything out on a large screen. When she finished, she turned to me and said, "You do realize what this means, right? You have control over every waterway that connects to the system. That includes several that run through residential developments." I nodded slowly. "Including the one managed by the HOA," I said. She gave a knowing smile. Then I'd say they're in for a surprise. Driving home that afternoon, I felt a renewed sense of confidence. The power dynamic had shifted completely. For years, the HOA had operated under the assumption that they controlled the neighborhood's shared spaces. They fined people for having boats that were too large, for fishing without a community permit, even for hosting small gatherings by the water. They had built their little empire on an illusion of authority, and now that illusion was crumbling. That evening, I sat out on my dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and thought about how to use this new information. I wasn't interested in revenge or causing chaos. What I wanted was balance, an end to their bullying and control. I decided the best approach was transparency. The next morning, I drafted a letter addressed to every homeowner in the HOA-managed community. I explained that the waterways, including the lake and connected streams, were privately owned by me, and that I was reviewing access rights and permits. I made it clear I wasn't planning to restrict anyone's use of the water, but I wanted everyone to understand the truth: the HOA had no legal claim over it. I mailed out the letters and waited. It didn't take long for the reaction. Within days, my phone started ringing non-stop. Some people called to thank me. They'd been dealing with the HOA's harassment for years and were thrilled to learn the board's authority didn't extend to the water. Others were cautious, unsure what this meant for property values or future access. A few were angry, assuming I would start charging fees or imposing restrictions. I assured them that nothing would change except that the HOA could no longer interfere. By the end of the week, I heard that the HOA board had held another emergency meeting. Rumors spread quickly. They had called in lawyers, pored over county maps, and even tried to contact the state water authority to challenge my ownership. But every time they hit a dead end. The records were clear and legally binding. My grandfather had filed everything correctly, and the county had recognized the rights for decades without dispute. The HOA had built its entire community around a resource it never actually controlled. When one of the board members finally called me, his tone was different from before. Gone was the arrogance and condescension. He sounded nervous. "We'd like to discuss a possible agreement," he said. "Perhaps a formal partnership between you and the HOA to manage the waterways collaboratively." I almost laughed. They were still trying to save face, pretending they could negotiate from a position of power. I told him politely that no partnership was necessary, that I would continue to allow residents to use the water freely as long as the HOA stopped issuing fines or making rules about it. He reluctantly agreed, knowing they had no leverage. Later that night, as I sat by the water again, the moonlight reflecting off the calm surface, I thought about my grandfather and what he would have said. He was a quiet man, but he believed in fairness and self-reliance. He would have told me that some people mistake control for responsibility, that real power doesn't come from enforcing rules but from understanding what you own and protecting it wisely. I finally understood what he meant. This wasn't about beating the HOA at their own game. It was about preserving something that rightfully belonged to our family and ensuring it couldn't be abused by those who saw it only as a means to profit or control others. In the weeks that followed, the community slowly began to change. The HOA stopped their petty enforcement, and for the first time in years, people started enjoying the water again. Families fished off their docks without fear of fines, kids paddled their kayaks without being told they needed a permit, and neighbors who'd once been wary of speaking up against the board started sharing stories of their own frustrations. It felt like the whole place was finally breathing freely again. I didn't seek attention or credit for it, but word got around anyway. Some started calling me the man who owns the water, half in jest, half in awe. I didn't correct them. I just smiled and let them believe what they wanted. Deep down, I knew it wasn't really about ownership, it was about standing up to people who abused authority and remembering that sometimes, the quiet truths buried in old papers hold more power than any modern rulebook ever could. The weeks following the HOA's failed attempts to challenge my ownership of the waterways were strangely quiet. The same people who once strutted through the neighborhood, measuring lawns and snapping pictures of mailboxes that didn't match community standards, now avoided eye contact when they saw me. For the first time in years, there were no warning letters, no inspection notices, no passive-aggressive emails from the HOA board. The silence was refreshing, but I knew it wasn't just peace, it was the calm before something bigger. Power like theirs doesn't fade quietly, it crumbles, then collapses all at once. I just didn't realize how fast it would happen. It began when several homeowners started asking for refunds on the fines they had paid over the years. Without control of the waterways, many of those fines were invalid, and people wanted their money back. The HOA board tried to claim that the funds had already been used for community improvements, but that excuse didn't hold up. When a few residents threatened to take legal action, the cracks in the organization widened. I watched from the sidelines as the same board that had bullied and intimidated so many people turned on itself. Some members resigned, others tried to shift blame, and before long, the entire leadership structure was in disarray. Around that time, a local reporter contacted me after hearing whispers about the situation. She wanted to verify whether it was true that one man owned all the county's waterways. I hesitated at first, not wanting unnecessary attention, but after thinking about it, I agreed to speak with her. We met at my dock on a bright morning, the water shimmering behind us as she set up her recorder. I told her the story from the beginning, how the HOA had tried to force me to remove my dock, how I discovered my grandfather's documents, and how the truth unraveled everything. When the article came out a week later, it spread fast. People all over the county began realizing that their lakes, streams, and ponds were part of the same network I controlled. The story painted me not as a land baron, but as a quiet homeowner who had stood up to an overreaching HOA and uncovered a forgotten piece of history. For once, the headlines weren't about greed or conflict, they were about fairness, about someone reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. The attention had an unexpected effect. Local officials began looking into how the HOA had been operating. It turned out they had been enforcing regulations that weren't legally backed, collecting thousands of dollars in fines for rules they had no authority to make. The county issued a formal audit, and what followed was chaos for the board. Their finances were frozen, their leadership dissolved, and eventually, the HOA itself was suspended pending investigation. The same people who had strutted around with clipboards and threats were now scrambling to explain themselves to lawyers and auditors. Meanwhile, the homeowners who had been under their thumb were finally free. I remember standing on my porch one evening, watching kids swim near the dock while their parents sat nearby laughing and talking freely. It had been years since I'd seen that kind of easy happiness in this community. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's necks, the place felt alive again. But even as things settled locally, I couldn't ignore the larger implications of what I had uncovered. Owning the waterways didn't just mean having control, it meant having responsibility. I began receiving letters from other communities across the county asking about water access, maintenance, and environmental protection. Some wanted formal agreements for fishing rights or irrigation use. It was overwhelming at first, but then I remembered my grandfather's words about stewardship. He had always believed that the one who controls the water controls life itself, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. I decided to honor that vision. I reached out to the county and proposed a plan to create a conservation trust. The idea was simple: the waterways would remain under private ownership, but they would be managed sustainably for the good of everyone. I wasn't interested in profit. I wanted to preserve the ecosystem and protect residents from any future power grabs. Setting up the trust took months, and during that time, I worked closely with environmental experts and local leaders. We cleaned up old, neglected areas, removed invasive plants, and built new access points for public recreation. For the first time, people from all over the county came together around a shared resource that had once divided them. The irony wasn't lost on me: the very thing the HOA had tried to control had become the symbol of community unity. The county recognized the effort with an official proclamation, thanking me for my contribution to public welfare. I accepted it quietly, knowing my grandfather would have been proud. Meanwhile, the former HOA board faced the consequences of their arrogance. Several members were fined for mismanagement, and the association was permanently dissolved. The neighborhood reorganized under a voluntary committee that focused on cooperation instead of enforcement. It was strange seeing some of the same faces that had once glared at me now offering friendly waves when I passed by. People changed when they were freed from fear. They planted gardens without worrying about approved colors, painted their doors however they liked, and spent their weekends enjoying the water instead of attending mandatory meetings. As for me, I found peace in simple things again. Mornings by the water, evenings with neighbors who had become friends, and quiet nights where the only sound was the wind moving through the reeds. Sometimes I'd look out at the reflection of the moon on the surface and think about how fragile control really is. The HOA had built an empire on paperwork and pretense, and it had taken nothing more than a few forgotten documents to bring it all down. What they never understood was that authority isn't about rules or fear, it's about respect. You can't demand it, you have to earn it. A few months later, I received one last letter from the former HOA president. It wasn't a demand or a complaint. It was an apology. He admitted that they had overstepped, blinded by the sense of power that came from telling others what to do. He thanked me, oddly enough, for reminding him that ownership doesn't equal control. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply wrote back, "We all learn eventually." That was the end of it. The county thrived under the new system, and over time, my dock became a sort of landmark. People would stop by to fish, talk, or just sit for a while. I welcomed them all. The water had become more than property, it was a living thread that connected us. Every ripple carried memories of what we did, overcome the arrogance, the conflict, the fear, and replaced them with something lasting, freedom. When I look back now, I realize that this whole ordeal wasn't just about proving ownership or defeating an HOA. It was about reclaiming dignity. My grandfather's legacy had reminded me that true power lies not in controlling others, but in protecting what matters. The water still moves through this county, quiet and steady, shaping the land as it always has. And I, its unlikely steward, have learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from letting peace finally take root where conflict once ruled.